Look, we were sort of lucky in that when I'm not doing running Surrogacy Australia, I run a research company that does research, and so we decided the best use of my resources for a little bit of my time would be maybe to gather some reliable data on what's happening in Australia for us and for the media and for conferences sort of here and around the world. So I'm going to sort of take you through some of those findings in a minute. Just going to check that. Going to go a page down. Well, I'm going to draw on 3 data sources today. The survey that some of you filled out back in January, February this year, we had an extraordinary response rate to that online survey. About 217 of you filled it out. It was fairly lengthy, but it went through a whole lot of questions about how you approach surrogacy, you know, whether you tried IVF first, whether you looked at altruistic surrogacy or not, what your costs were involved, and what stage you're at and satisfaction and so forth. So we're going to look at some of that data today. I'm also going to draw on some data from work we've done with 14 of the key overseas agencies in the last 2 years. We've been collecting data from them on the number of kids they report coming home, babies coming home from Australia, to look at where the growth, if you like. 2 other sources actually. One is the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare publishes data on altruistic surrogacy births. We'll have a look at that to compare that. And finally, we'll look at Department of Immigration and Citizenship data on citizenship by descent out of India, to see how that's grown over the last 4 or so years. That was from a Freedom of Information request we made to the government to get that data very, very recently, and we waited maybe 2 or 3 months for that, but it's just come through. All right. In terms of prior Australian IVF experience, I think about 100 or so of the respondents to that survey we did were heterosexual couples. 63% of them had previously engaged with an ART clinic here in Australia. And on average, if they had done that, they'd spent about 3 years trying to conceive naturally before they'd gone to a clinic. And then they'd done, on average, 7 embryo transfers here at home before they decided to go overseas or started to consider other options. So most people, in terms of on average, tend to have quite a lot of goes in Australia with their own embryos before they realise it's just not working, you know. And as many of you know, doctors will often encourage you to try again and again and again. We've got this technique you can try, that technique you can try. And so they're the figures for heterosexual in our group. In terms of pathways, we had, what have we got, 61 plus 36, so it's about 97 heterosexuals did this survey. So 2/3 of them engaged with the Australian IVF clinic, 1/3 didn't. Of those red people who engaged with the clinic, we asked them, well, which of these things did you consider, altruistic, both, or commercial only? And as you can see, those red arrows show that most who'd done IVF first considered both options, you know, and a minority considered, you know, only one or the other. Those who hadn't gone through IVF, the green people in that arrow, they were much more likely to consider commercial or both, but very few considered altruistic only, I suppose, because they hadn't had that influence of the IVF clinic in Australia, perhaps. When we tracked those people in terms of the ones who considered altruistic, 27 of them actually said they located someone in Australia to carry for them. And then 20 of those people said they actually commenced an altruistic arrangement in Australia. And as you can see, we asked people what was the outcome there. 11 said they were still in process, and 4 successful, 4 failed. Failed meaning, you know, the arrangement fell apart, we decided it wasn't going to work, or so forth. On the far right-hand side, you can see the people who went into commercial arrangements of this 97 odd people, about 38 of them there, who commenced commercial, and some who were trying altruistic who went into commercial after that. So that's sort of the pattern we had in terms of that heterosexual sample. When it comes to the same-sex market, there was much more likely that people would go straight for commercial there. As you can see, 74 of our respondents said that. 9 did say they located someone in Australia to carry for them, but only 4 said they commenced an arrangement. 2 of them successful, 2 in the process. Most of them are going straight for commercial surrogacy, you can see there. Or they're shifting from trying altruistic in terms of looking into it, discussing it a bit, and then shifting over into it after having a try. If you look at this data in terms of, this is stuff from the government in terms of the cycles that are undergone for altruistic surrogacy, you can see that over the last 2005, 2009, the only data we've got, about 80% of altruistic surrogacy cycles result in a live birth in the first 5 years, was what they found. That's sort of averaging out this white line, if you like, here, over the 5 years. Some years it was 20%, some years it was 18% went to a live birth. So obviously what's happening is, people are doing the process, but they're having to have many attempts, of course, to get a successful pregnancy out of it if they're going through altruistic. And I don't know how the figures compare to overseas in terms of commercial arrangements, but obviously the rationale in Australia here is there's usually only one embryo transfer at a time. So that's probably one of the other reasons. That also, of course, we'll talk about that later. We asked people about why they didn't consider altruistic surrogacy. What were the main reasons for that? And the key ones that came up were the risk of the surrogate changing your mind, deciding to keep the child, for both gay and heterosexual respondents, or, as you can see, asking the surrogate to carry for love was being an unfair exchange. Just not being able to pay them more than costs was seen as being just too big an ask, was a key thing, particularly, as you can see, for that heterosexual market there. Another big reason, more so for the heterosexual community, was just not having anyone at the right stage or life stage to ask. Just don't know anybody who's, my siblings are too old now, or they're not going to fit the criteria, or I just don't feel comfortable asking them. And this other one's probably quite important to raise here, just being too long and complicated to process, being a sort of a barrier too for quite a lot of people there. Those who investigated altruistic but then decided against it, we asked them, well, why didn't you actually go ahead with it? Again, the top reason it was interesting was just unable to find someone to carry altruistically. They'd often done inquiries online, on websites, forums where mums who are interested in this, might contact them. But often they'd reported, look, these mums or potential mums want money for it, and I know that's illegal in Australia, so we can't go ahead. Risking damaging relationships with a friend or family member was quite important. Too long, complex process again, and either no one offering to carry or not being comfortable asking someone to carry were other key things. But there's a whole list of things that came up in response to that question, which we've sort of heard a bit about this weekend already. Some of it involving not locating an egg donor, that being hard to do. Let's now look a bit at the altruistic births in Australia. The government hasn't released the data for 2010-11 yet, but the last 5 years before that, you can see the number of births is a trickle when it comes into the regulated systems. We're getting sort of 6 cases 2005 through to 19 live births that were successful in 2009. So the numbers are very small, and you've heard a bit this weekend about probably why that is, in a way. If you compare that then, though, to the overseas figures, and this now comes from our own survey of clinics, those 14 leading clinics out of India, US and Thailand, you can see we've had quite an increase in, and those figures dwarf obviously the figures for Australia. We've had quite a large increase. Now this is self-report. We asked the clinic to self-report how many babies are being born to them each year, and it's only the 14 clinics, so this is obviously an under-report, but it's showing a huge jump in births, certainly from 2010 to 11. 2012 is looking similar to 2011 in terms of that's predicted really, because we haven't sort of finished the year yet, but that's what people are reporting is going to be happening by end of June this year, so next month. And it's looking like, though, you know, India is increasing gradually. US seems to be going down a little, and Thailand staying fairly steady in terms of the country. If we look at where people are getting information from, the main parents, that is, intending parents, the main thing is overseas agency websites, speaking to past clients and reading blogs. Key things people talk about. And as most of you know, they were the only things we've had available to us for most time. The Gay Dads Australia is very, very popular with the gay dads like me. Surrogacy Australia, of course, it's been quite popular, our own website. But there's a whole range of places people go to. Some of them actually ring up the agencies, of course, do Skype calls, but many of those will be familiar to you. We obviously put on these coffee catch-ups every quarter to try and get people together to talk, because the main thing people want to do in the absence of events like this is talk to other families who've done it. So that's what we sort of try and help out with. If you look at the survey data we got back from, actually no, this is from our parents' survey we did. We asked people what country did you use and what year did you do that, and you can see there's been a huge rise in Australians using India, and a drop-off in the US. If you compare 2008 and prior births to sort of the last sort of two years or so, and other countries have sort of also dropped off from 19% down to 6%. So India's getting the bulk of Australian business at the moment, clearly. This data shows us the number of citizenship by descent applications that the Australian government's been processing every year out of India in the last 4 years. Now that's also going to include some Australians who are resident in India and having kids in India while they're, you know, perhaps working there. So these are going to be an over-report. These aren't all going to be surrogacy babies, but it still shows you there's been a definite rise in the number of those citizenship by descent applications in the last 4 years to quite enormous numbers. Last year, nearly 400 babies. And I think we can probably assume that most of those are surrogacy births. I mean, I would probably estimate perhaps 50 of those in each year are registered to Australians resident overseas who are working there. So we're talking about large numbers. We asked the government just for the data for children who were 0 to 2 months of age, so kids who were registered very, very early, as we all do if we bring kids home. Okay, what are the costs people are paying for surrogacy, whether they do it altruistically in India or in the USA? They were our biggest response markets we got. 24 people responded in terms of what they paid for altruistic. We asked people to estimate what they paid for all their costs, so not just the surrogacy agency costs, but their legal fees, their post-birth medicals, their egg donors, their hospital costs, their travel and accommodation, and their insurance. And as you can see, there's marked differences between different countries. Altruistic, the average cost, these are averages here of course, was $45,000 for those who were successful with an altruistic arrangement in Australia, compared to an average of $77,000 odd for India, and an average of $176,000 or so for the USA. The bulk of that comes in that green box there, the surrogacy agency costs there. In Australia, of course, that's the IVF agency costs, and we are a bit concerned as an organisation about that proportion being so high, not only overseas but even here in Australia for altruistic arrangements. You know, the agencies here are making a lot of money out of altruistic surrogacy, and we get lots of complaints from members about how high the fees charged are for surrogacy in Australia versus normal IVF, and there's lots of people who do say it's outrageous that they're charged so much more than if they were just doing normal IVF, when the clinics in Australia don't actually do anything extra in terms of facilitating that. So there's an issue there which we may have to spend some time lobbying on to look at what's going on here, because in our mind that shouldn't be so high, that $24,000 average they're paying to clinics in Australia. But that'll be useful just for those of you who are thinking about doing this and looking at budgeting and taking out remortgages on your homes. what you're likely to be up for as an average. Now, some people report double these amounts. Some people report, $20,000 less than these amounts. But as I say, the average is what you're seeing on this chart here. So you do need to be prepared if things go wrong, and you need to have multiple attempts, that the costs could easily double over what I'm presenting here for you. For example, I mean, we were a tough story, and maybe we would have spent probably double that Indian average there in Australia, but it was just bad luck. It was nothing to do with, the clinic or the quality of care.
What's the standard deviations on that? Any idea?
What's that? The stand?
Yeah.
Look, I haven't got them in. They were fairly wide.
Per child, or is that?
That's per birth. So
Sam,
yes.
can I just point out a little anomaly there?
Yes.
Megan and I work for SCI Healthcare. When you've got the surrogacy agency costs, and I'm only speaking for our clinic.
Yes.
You've got a basic package. Remember, a lot of that is hospital cost in there.
Yeah.
It's your scans.
Yeah.
It's your treatment for the surrogate. It's your medications. It might be your egg donor. So, for instance, when you say that green section is surrogacy agency costs,
that's a really good point.
That kind of money.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's accommodation
and
I would assume that's the same for the US. I don't know.
That's
a lot of misleading there.
Yeah, the agency. Yeah, agency is just not agency in the
And
US.
that's also your surrogacy
like you have
compensations in that as well.
Look, you've raised a really good point, Megan. You're right, because the agencies in India do roll up many more costs in one package than they do in the US. But the US also rolls things up. So you're right. The way these have been distributed is probably not so accurate in terms of what they actually cover. So I'd probably encourage you more to look at the totals rather than where it's all fitting here.
And the exchange rate. The exchange rate made a huge exchange rate.
The exchange rate, sure. Yeah.
Can I just ask, is the legal government fees, is that just in India or the US, or is that a combination of the Australian government legal and government fees?
Can you repeat the question, please?
The question was, does the legal fees that we ask people to provide cover legal fees just for Australia or Australia plus overseas? And those fees were for all legal fees people pay in Australia or overseas. Michael?
The Australian surrogacy agency costs you've mentioned include IVF. I think you should be having a crack at Medicare. Medicare specifically says you cannot charge surrogacy costs against Medicare. IVF clinics are excluded from charging that, and
Yes.
so legally
Yes.
if they do.
That's true. That's true. And that has been an issue for a lot of our parents, is they have been complaining about that issue of lack of a rebate for that. Yeah, Meg?
Sorry, and also just one more point. Like, for instance, all the clinics are getting better. Everybody is, again, just speaking about India, when you've got an average of 77, well, people like me, I flew in 2 Caucasian donors. This is when I thought it's a one-shot wonder, I've got an egg donor, it's all going to work, etc. So I actually calculated our costs, and I participated in the survey.
Yeah.
It cost me and my husband $90,000. Okay, but I deal with a lot of Australian clients, and the bulk of Australian clients, I've actually got a cost schedule, which I'm happy to give to anybody if you want to email me. It would be about the same for all of the Indian clinics. And if you go in and if you get pregnant the first time, you pay your surrogacy package, they're all about the same. You're looking at your travel accommodation, your DNA testing and everything, you're looking at about 40,000. So if you ever see in the paper...
Yeah, but you can't say it's for 40,000 when you don't know what the success rate is going to be.
No, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, so that's why we didn't...
The majority of people are spending 40,000, in my experience.
In your experience, yeah. As I said, we're
if you
just
don't get pregnant first time, then it's going to go up.
Yeah. So as I said, we're just presenting the data for the 200 people who responded to our survey and what they reported spending. So you will get different answers from clinics in terms of what their clients spend. And often they don't ask their clients about what they spend on their airfares and their accommodation and so forth. So all those things you need to take into account as well, of course, when you're sort of budgeting for this. And look carefully at that. How do people afford this? We asked people, how did you afford to do this? And most people, over half, 51%, said they remortgaged or refinanced their home. Took out extra money on their home mortgage. Luckily in Australia, a lot of us do have equity in our property, and we've been able to afford to do that if we're a bit older. Or lots of people just said, oh, we cut back on our spending. You know, I'm on a good salary, we can afford it, but we just had to cut back a bit, tighten our belts, take money from investments, get out a separate bank loan. Some people, I know Rodney Cruzell had a favourite story about going to his bank manager and saying, oh, I need to get a bank loan for home improvements, non-structural home improvements. And I always loved that. That was terrific. And the bank said, yes, that sounds fine. We can allow that loan if you call it that. So what about egg donors? What proportion of different markets use egg donors? And as you can see, the majority of gay respondents did. I don't know how those 11%, what they were doing without a donor. Perhaps they hadn't thought about that yet. Maybe. Anyway, a quarter of the heterosexual market, 23% said that yes, they need to donor from the start. Quite a lot do try with their own eggs. 31% try with their own eggs first and then have to go to a donor after trying with their own eggs, as you can see there, whereas about half had gone through the process or had started the process and were hoping to stay without a donor. And as you can see, the average they're spending on accessing egg donors is $9,000 to $16,000. So quite a large range of costs in terms of what they're spending on a donor. It can be very large. Some of us have flown donors in from other countries. And there's a cost associated with that. You know, it can be very cost effective to use a donor in India if you're using a clinic in India. So there's ways of keeping those costs down to very manageable levels, but you've got to be careful about that.
Would that include the treatment for the donor as well?
No. That's just for the donors to turn up. Yeah. Yeah, the treatment for the donor is included in the surrogacy package we looked at earlier. Okay, these days India is the commonest source of donors, probably because so many people go to India for their IVF treatments, surrogacy treatments anyway. US, you know, fairly common. South Africa, there's Global Egg Donors, some of you may know of, has had donors out of South Africa for a while, but I believe that's stopping now. Is that Meg? Right, Meg?
Yeah, they've all been shut down in South Africa with the exception of somebody called Verdant International, and I think they donate to our clinic, but also they're Mumbai based, so I assume they donate for some other clinics.
Yeah.
The Global Egg Donors no longer South Africa, and there were a few others because they basically the powers that be said no, you can't send donors overseas.
Yeah, there's quite a few. You met Mariam yesterday from New Life, who has lots of donors coming out of Eastern Europe, and quite a few Australians now are starting to bring in donors to India out of Eastern Europe, where the country she operates, and they work in conjunction with all the major IVF agencies. And you know, Georgia, for example, Ukraine are hers. Okay. Now, this was interesting. Average embryo transfers by country. Survey respondents reported an average of 2 transfers if they were using the US, an average of 3 transfers if they used India. Okay, so basically, you know, you might need a few more transfers, 1 more transfer on average if you used India, but your costs are going to be less. And average donors used by country. Interestingly enough, in the USA, 63% of people who use only 1 donor, whereas that was people using 1 donor was much less if they were in India. They were much more likely to have used 2 donors, 32% there, because perhaps they hadn't worked with the first donor, maybe. So this was to manage your expectations. Know a bit about that. We asked people, well, where would you consider going for surrogacy in the future if you did have another child, for people who, you know, who'd already had a child. And it was interesting to see how many people said, oh, I'd go for India rather than Australia. And again, this is concerning in terms of the failure of Australia to put in place a workable surrogacy system, in that people would still prefer to go over to India, and all the problems and hoopla you have to go through to do that is still more popular than Australia for people. The US is about equivalent to Australia in terms of where people would go, putting aside cost. Okay, Thailand's still sort of, you know, a very low percent. All right, we also asked people, well, what sort of reaction did you get from those you confided in when you told people about fact that you were having children through surrogacy, through commercial surrogacy.
Just go back to that previous slide. I just want to make sure I get the units right on the x-axis. You're saying only 12% of gay couples, or gay same-sex domestic clinics, found the service friendly and caring?
No, this was an open-ended question, so people could type in what they wanted to, and we grouped these up. So basically, that's just saying that when we asked them what reason did you say, some 12% bothered to put in a response that was something like friendly, caring staff. Okay, so it wasn't as if we didn't ask them, were they friendly and caring? No.
But you can infer that they weren't compelled to put in the response there.
All you can infer was that they were, because this is an open-ended question, you can just say that the most common thing they thought of when we asked them about satisfaction was support, communication and client liaison. You've got to remember that most of us deal with the agencies face-to-face only on perhaps 2 occasions during the process. Most of our dealings with agencies are via email and phone. So that friendly, caring thing is not such an important thing for many of us because we're not face-to-face with these agencies.
Sam, can I just make an interpretation of that?
Yeah.
The reason you've got the higher hetero 38% there.
Yeah.
Can I ask about why you filled out the surveys?
That's a really good point.
That's completely
That's a really good point. Actually, you're right. Yeah. True. That's true. And you're right. Women are more likely to. I've forgotten that. Women are more likely to actually value that as a commodity, as an issue, than a male is. Good point. Yeah. All right. Any other final questions? All right.
Thanks, Sam.